What if truth in cinema wasn't spoken in dialogue, but flickered in the missing frames, cut away, mislabeled, left to gather dust behind the projector's hum? In the late light of a dying reel, a certain kind of American hero steps forward, not to be crowned, but to be measured, punished, and slowly erased. The cities look familiar, the wars feel distant, the badge still gleams, yet the eyes behind it have learned to lower themselves. Justice arrives late, limping, and the crowd no longer cheers. 5 films peer into that silence, where vengeance loses its voice and institutions swallow their own. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. In the late 70s, American cinema began to lose faith in its own reflection. The age of the heroic cowboy and the righteous cop was giving way to something colder, a mirror that showed not courage, but consequence. The war had followed the soldiers home. The system they fought for had turned on them. Directors like Clint Eastwood, John Flynn, and Walter Hill began crafting stories that weren't about glory, but about guilt. Heroes no longer saved anyone. They simply survived what the world had become. Audiences, too, were changing, tired of propaganda, hungry for confession. These films weren't meant to entertain, they were designed to exorcise. And Hollywood, uncomfortable with what it saw, quietly turned the projector off. Let's rewind to the 5 films that crossed the line between entertainment and confession. Film 1, Death Wish v. The Face of Death, 1994. The reel opens with an aging man in a gray suit, eyes colder than the gun he hides. Charles Bronson returns as Paul Kersey, once a symbol of vigilante justice, now a ghost wandering through the ruins of his own myth. In this final chapter, the blood is thicker, the city darker, and the silence heavier. The film sold itself as closure, but what it truly captured was decay, the death of a cinematic god America no longer prayed to. When Death Wish 5 arrived, the moral tide had already turned. The Reagan-era fantasy of the lone avenger cleaning the streets had rotted into parody. Kersey was no longer a man with a mission. He was a relic, punished for the sins of an era that believed violence could heal itself. Even Bronson's face, lined, weary, half in shadow, seemed to understand that the world had moved on without him. Behind the camera, even the producers knew it was over. The film was shot cheaply in Toronto, pretending to be New York, its frames stripped of the mythic grit that once made Kersey a folk hero. Hollywood had grown embarrassed by him, but couldn't look away, so they buried him in plain sight. And when the credits rolled, it wasn't the villains who died. It was the idea of the American Avenger itself fading to black beneath the quiet hum of a dying reel. Film 2, Southern Comfort, 1981. A swamp, mist thick as breath. The sound of water moving where no one is supposed to be. Walter Hill's Southern Comfort begins like a war movie without a war, a group of National Guardsmen on a weekend exercise deep in the Louisiana bayou. They're bored, careless, loud. When they steal a canoe from the local Cajuns, a single gunshot shatters the illusion of safety. The soldiers retaliate, and suddenly, playtime becomes a hunt. But this isn't about the swamp. It's about America, chasing itself. On the surface, it's a survival thriller, men against nature, fear against reason. But beneath the mud and gunfire, the film bleeds metaphor. Hill never says, Vietnam, yet every frame whispers it. The arrogance, the confusion, the moral blindness, they all echo a nation that sent its sons into a jungle they didn't understand, and watched them come back as strangers. The studio marketed Southern Comfort as action. What they got was accusation. Test screenings were uneasy, critics were split, and audiences turned away, uncomfortable with a mirror that didn't flatter. For Hill, the swamp was never a place, it was a state of mind. A fog America still hadn't escaped, and when the final flare lit up the darkness, it wasn't victory. It was exposure, the cruel light revealing what was always there, a country still at war with itself. Film 3, Rolling Thunder, 1977. The man steps off the plane, smiling stiffly for the cameras. He's a returning hero, a Vietnam POW finally home. The crowd cheers. His son doesn't recognize him. His wife already loves someone else. And in that silent fracture, Rolling Thunder begins. William Devane plays Major Charles Rain, a man whose soul never left captivity. Paul Schrader's original script was brutal, a study in trauma, alienation, and the quiet violence of survival. But Hollywood panicked. The studio cut away the darkest scenes, replacing psychological wounds with gunfights. What remained was a revenge film that pretended to heal, while its heart still bled underneath. On the surface, Rolling Thunder is about justice. Beneath it, it's about damage, the kind a nation doesn't want to name. When Rain's family is murdered, he doesn't weep. He polishes his guns, visits an old friend, and plans to finish the war alone. The vengeance is mechanical, almost ritualistic, like he's trying to feel human again through the act of killing. Critics were divided. Some called it exploitation, others called it truth. Schrader later admitted the cuts saved the studio, but killed the film's soul, because Rolling Thunder wasn't meant to glorify revenge. It was meant to expose what revenge looks like when the war follows you home. And as the final shots ring out in a border brothel, Rain doesn't triumph. He simply disappears, another ghost of America's unfinished war. Film 4. Red Scorpion, 1988. In the desert heat, a Soviet soldier kneels beneath the burning sun, watching the flag of his empire ripple like a wound. Dolph Lundgren's Nikolai isn't the clean-cut hero Hollywood usually offers. He's a man built by propaganda, now learning what it means to unlearn obedience. Red Scorpion begins as a Cold War fantasy, but ends as something far more unsettling. A film that exposed the strange bedfellows of politics and cinema. Produced by Jack Abramoff, yes, the same man who would later become infamous in Washington, the movie was secretly funded through channels connected to South Africa's apartheid regime. It was supposed to be a piece of anti-communist spectacle, a story of freedom versus tyranny. But the hypocrisy was too loud to ignore. Hollywood, suddenly aware of where the money came from, distanced itself. The film's theatrical run evaporated. Critics tore it apart not for its violence, but for its morality. And yet beneath the smoke of its controversy, Red Scorpion carries a strange truth. Nikolai's journey, a man rejecting his uniform, his country, and his orders mirrors the way the film itself turned against its creators. Its rebellion born out of guilt. A story made to serve power, but ending up questioning it. When the final explosion fades, Nikolai stands alone in the dust, no longer a soldier, not yet free. A silhouette against the same sun that burned his flag away. Red Scorpion was never forgiven because it told the wrong truth at the wrong time. That every ideology, once lit, casts its own shadow. Film 5, The Gauntlet 1977. A bus riddled with bullet holes crawls through the streets of Phoenix. Inside, Clint Eastwood grips the wheel, his face carved in defiance. Around him, a storm of gunfire from the very police force he once served. The Gauntlet isn't a story about pursuit, it's a confession. A man and a woman against an entire system built to silence them. Eastwood both directed and starred in the film, and that duality bleeds through every frame. As Officer Ben Shockley, he's tasked with escorting a witness to testify against powerful men. But somewhere along the road, he realizes the truth. The assignment is a setup, and he's the one marked for execution. What follows isn't heroism, it's survival inside a machine designed to erase those who know too much. Hollywood promoted it as an action spectacle, yet beneath the explosions lies an uncomfortable metaphor. The Gauntlet is about institutional rot, a system so corrupt that morality becomes a death wish. Eastwood, the archetype of American justice, turns his gun on the very world that made him a star. Every bullet tearing through that bus feels like a rejection of the myth he once embodied. When the final scene unfolds, the bus limping into the courthouse, the crowd stunned into silence. Eastwood doesn't play the hero anymore. He plays the last honest man in a rigged game, driving through hell just to be heard. It wasn't just his character who was under fire. It was Hollywood itself and the illusion of justice it had been selling for decades. Bonus fact: The Exterminator 1980. Before Vigilantes grew old, before justice was franchised into endless sequels, there was The Exterminator, a film too brutal, too honest, and too uncomfortably close to the streets it portrayed. Directed by James Glickenhaus, it begins with a Vietnam veteran dragged back into another kind of war, not against soldiers this time, but against the decay of his own city. John Eastland, played by Robert Ginty, returns from combat only to see his best friend beaten nearly to death by gang members. The system shrugs. The police look away. So he picks up a flamethrower and begins burning the rot out of New York. It sounds like Pulp Fiction, but Glickenhaus shot it like a nightmare documentary, raw, grainy, almost sickly real. That was the problem. It wasn't the violence that terrified censors. It was the authenticity. When it premiered, scenes were slashed without warning. Critics called it fascist. Others saw it as a cry from a generation left behind by both their government and their gods. The uncut version became legend, whispered about in midnight screenings and bootleg tapes. But the message was never about vengeance. It was about absence. The absence of mercy, of justice, of belief that anything could be fixed anymore. Hollywood tried to bury it under its own label of exploitation. Yet, in the dark corners of film history, The Exterminator still burns not as entertainment, but as evidence. Proof that some stories aren't lost because they failed. They're lost because they told the truth too clearly. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. When the dust settles, what remains isn't victory, it's silence. Each of these films, Death Wish v. Southern Comfort, Rolling Thunder, Red Scorpion, and The Gauntlet, tried to hold a mirror to a country that no longer recognized its own reflection. They asked what happens when righteousness corrodes into revenge, when the hero becomes indistinguishable from the villain, and when the system he serves turns the crosshairs inward. By the end of the 20th century, Hollywood had stopped making men like these not because audiences didn't care, but because the myth had become too heavy to carry. The real had burned too close to the truth. These weren't action movies. They were confessions disguised as gunfire, elegies wrapped in gun smoke. Each bullet, each explosion, was a plea. See what we've become. The light flickers. The tape hums. A hero's face dissolves into grain and static. In the blur between justice and survival, America's heroes didn't die on the battlefield. They were edited out in post-production. In the end, the only thing more fragile than a hero is the story that tried to make him immortal. So what do we really watch when we watch justice? A performance or a confession? These 5 films dared to show the moment when America stopped believing in its own heroes, when the gun no longer stood for truth but for denial. Tell me which of these lost reels still burns in your memory. Which one feels too close to home? Because somewhere between the frames they cut and the endings they rewrote lies the story Hollywood couldn't quite bury. Real secrets, where the truth was always in the edit.